it's impossible to simply hope that there's a trend somewhere. We just heard examples, very concrete examples of individuals who made a difference by the kind of work that they did. Slow work. I'm sure none of them could have known exactly where that work was going. And that's what it's going to take to make sure that we have a future for human rights. And when I say it depends on all of us, I mean also the non-lawyers in the room, assuming we have some non-lawyers in the room. But it also depends very much on the lawyers. And I think the closest I can get to trying to think about where we might go or where we go from here is to help us take one last look at where we've been and how we got to here. Because I think that's where you can find some of the clues to what we need to do to advance human rights in the future. And it's particularly appropriate, I think, to have that discussion linked to the discussion of the inter-American system. Many of us who have been activists for a lot of years really began our work in human rights because of 9/11. And I don't mean the 9/11 in 2001, I mean 9/11 in 1973, the day when Salvador Allende was overturned and murdered in Chile. There, of course, were serious human rights violations before in places like Brazil and many other countries. But there was something about that experience in Chile that really galvanized the world in a way that none of us could have predicted or known, but that affected us all and began really the trajectory that we're still on today. There were, of course, human rights institutions. We had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We had the other declaration. We had many other mechanisms. But what happened in those days was that we saw the birth of the kind of movements that gave life to those mechanisms. They needed those mechanisms. They needed the international law. They needed the declarations that had been issued. They needed the kinds of the commission. They needed all of that. But the reverse is also true, that it's the movements that began to develop in response to the horrific, horrible violations that were coming out of the southern cone of Latin America that really began to breathe life and made people understand what was at stake in international law, that really moved international law from being something which, as I said earlier, was a bit, seemed a bit esoteric and a bit sort of detached from life, to something that people could see was really key to the lives of human beings around the world and the future of us all. It was an incredible time because of these movements that began to develop, both movements in the countries themselves against great odds, people taking action on human rights, like we heard earlier today, risking their lives, risking being tortured, risking imprisonment, and also transnational movements that really began to take life around this time, including my own movement, Amnesty International, but many other movements as well. And it was the alliance between what was happening inside countries and inside legal systems, and also what was happening internationally, both in the sense of transnational popular movements and also in terms of international law, that produced this incredible moment in history, beginning in the early 70s, that really demonstrated the power of human rights in a way that changed the course of human history. It demonstrated, of course, in terms of actual individual lives that were saved, people who were freed from prison, but it also demonstrated eventually in the overthrow of the kinds of tyrannies that we've been talking about all day. And it generated in that process, as we heard earlier today from so many speakers, the response of the legal community, the response of international law to meet the challenges. It's really this combination